Good morning, Vintage. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. I'm visiting here in Southern California with my wife and 3 of my children, and it's just such a warm welcome that we've received. I do feel like Vintage is kind of home from home because I've met a lot of people who have either lived in the UK or are from the UK. Your pastor here is from the UK, so it's just lovely to be with you. And as Gare said, I hope that what I bring this morning says something to your story, because we're all people who need a story to live by. And that's one of the things I've discovered in the course of hosting conversations over the years between Christians and non-Christians. And I'm going to tell you this morning about the way those conversations have changed in recent years. The new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, begins with a quotation from a well-known poem, 150 years old, by a Victorian poet, Matthew Arnold. And there's this famous stanza in the poem. It says, "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." I'm going to begin by depressing you this morning with this sort of well-worn line from this poem, which in Matthew Arnold's day in the Victorian era stood for the way in which he saw science and secularism coming in to replace religion. He saw faith and Christianity going out as the tide retreats. He talked about this melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And if you think it was bad in Matthew Arnold's day 150 years ago, that was actually the high point of church going in the UK. Think of what it's like today. We live in a very post-Christian age. And I think in many ways in the UK, we see a decline in church going, a decline in the number of people who call themselves Christian. For the first time in the last census, less than half the people in the UK said that they thought of themselves as Christian. And of course, the number going to church is far lower than that. And I suspect even in America, where you've had a strong church tradition, you're even seeing, especially among millennials and Gen Z, an increase in the number of people describing themselves as nones, N-O-N-E-S, people with no particular religious affiliation. And this is the world we live in now. This long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith is all around us. And many people, some of them going by the name of the new atheists, who we'll come to later, they've predicted the death of Christianity in the West. Surely Christianity is just going to continue to slip into irrelevance and decay. And the question is that the end of the story? Well, I had a really interesting conversation a few years ago with a secular thinker called Douglas Murray. I don't know if you've come across him, but he's quite well known in the UK. He's an intellectual. He's associate editor of The Spectator magazine. And Douglas Murray calls himself a Christian atheist. Now, that may sound like a contradiction in terms, a Christian atheist. The reason he calls himself that is that he doesn't believe in Christianity, and yet at the same time he recognizes that all the values and virtues he does believe in have essentially come from the Christian tradition in the West. And he quoted this famous line from Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach about the sea of faith and its melancholy, long withdrawing roar. And he said to me, "The thing is, Justin, that the sea doesn't only retreat, the sea of faith could come back in again. After all, that's the point of tides." And he said this in the context of seeing a number of his peers, thinking, intellectual people, who had actually begun to reconsider faith. Some of them had even become Christians as adults. And he said, perhaps, Justin, we're living in a moment where the church can speak into a more receptive crowd. And that was really the genesis, the catalyst, if you like, for this book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Because I think the conversation on God has been changing in all kinds of interesting ways in recent years. You see, I began to host conversations on faith in the heyday of what has sometimes been called the new atheism. There were the so-called 4 horsemen of new atheism. We've got them on the screen here, from left to right, a lineup. This is Richard Dawkins on the far left, Sam Harris, I think he's resident here in California, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. These were 4 atheists who published best-selling anti-God books, the best known perhaps Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, sold over 2 million copies. And they were headlining in news and media, TV, video, sold out conferences all over the world, heralding the death of religion and the rise of science and reason and an atheistic outlook on life. In the UK, we even had something called the Atheist Bus Campaign, which saw red London buses emblazoned with the logo, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And this was the era of the sort of mid-2000s when I started to host conversations between Christians and atheists on a show called Unbelievable. And it was really interesting. We had a lot of quite combative, thorough debates between some of the big names in the atheist world and Christian thinkers on the other side. I learned an awful lot in the process of hosting these debates over the 17 and a half years that I was host of the show. On the screen there, you can see a really interesting conversation between two psychologists. On the left is Susan Blackmore, an atheist psychologist. And on the right is an interesting psychologist called Jordan Peterson. We'll come back to him. Some of you may have heard of him, but they were debating whether we can make sense of life without God. And what's interesting is that Jordan Peterson represents, in my view, a real change in the tone of the conversation when it comes to non-believers, atheists, who nevertheless understand the value of Christian faith and what it's done for the West. And I've seen a real change in the conversation from those very combative debates between the new atheist thinkers and Christians to something very different today. Because effectively, I saw the new atheism begin to wane. I saw that it started off with this flurry of publicity. It started off with a blaze of glory, but soon enough, all kinds of issues began to emerge. There were internal fractures and disagreements between the leading new atheists themselves, to the point where even Richard Dawkins got his award from the American Humanist Association rescinded. He was actually stripped of his award because of his views on transgender, interestingly. There were all kinds of issues in the culture wars that came for new atheism early on. Not only that, though, apart from the internal meltdown that it experienced, I started to see that actually a lot of the people who had come to the movement found it didn't really answer their ultimate questions about purpose, about meaning. The new atheists had held up science and reason, if you like, as the things we should look to find purpose and meaning in life. But that's not what they're there for. The science and reason are great for some things, but they won't tell you how you should live your life. And in the place of the new atheist speakers, I've seen an interesting growth of conversation among these secular intellectuals, people like Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, and some others that I'll introduce to you in the course of this message. People beginning to take Christianity seriously again and asking whether we perhaps threw the baby out with the bathwater when we rejected the Christian story of reality. And in my new book and podcast series, I'm talking about what I've termed a surprising rebirth of belief in God in our culture. I think something is happening across the West right now, and it's taking shape in all kinds of manifestations, but I'm excited by the way the conversation around God is changing. I think this may be a moment when the church can speak into the culture in new ways, in new compelling and creative ways. If you want to hear that story in full, again, there's the podcast, but also the book as well, and you're welcome to grab a copy as you leave. I want to give you this morning 3 reasons why I think the conversation on God is changing, and why I believe there are really good reasons to believe in God. A lot of the time in my life, I've hosted these conversations between Christians and non-Christians. And the question really at the core of it all is, what is the best explanation? Does the atheist view of reality make best sense of things? That ultimately we live in a meaningless cosmos, that we're here essentially as a result of chance, in an otherwise meaningless universe? Or is the Christian view of reality that we're here by design, that there's a meaning behind our life, that there's a future that we all have a hope in? Which one of these is best explained by the data, the evidence, as Gare said, that's available to all of us? And I've spent a lot of my life looking at the reasons for faith and why I believe ultimately God is the best explanation for the things we see around us. But I've noticed increasingly it's not just Christian thinkers who are pointing this out. I'm meeting more and more secular thinkers who are pointing beyond themselves, beyond the universe, to a source behind it all. And I want to introduce some of them to you as we look at some of these reasons for God. The first reason I want to introduce is the idea that God is the best explanation for human existence. God makes sense of human existence. Now, science was one of the key things that the new atheists pointed to as a reason not to believe in God. They said the more we know about science, the less reason we have to believe in God. But actually, I think there's an alternative story of science to be told, one in which the more we learn about the extraordinary origins of our universe, the complexity of life, the more it seems to point towards a designer, someone behind the cosmos. And this isn't just Christian thinkers who are talking about this. One of the people that I've interviewed, fascinating individual, is Paul Davies, who's he's the lead person behind the Origin Center at Arizona State University, a brilliant scientist, a great popularizer of science too. Now, Paul Davies says he's not a conventionally religious person. He's kind of agnostic as far as his faith concerns. But he's been pointing out fascinating things like the way in which the universe itself seems to be set up for you and I to be here. Human existence, he says, is an extraordinary thing when you look at what it took for us to be sitting here on planet Earth, in the Milky Way, in this vast cosmos. There's something called the fine-tuning of the universe for life. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's this idea that actually when you look at the physics of the universe, all of the numbers and constants and precise qualities the universe had to have are just dialed to exactly the right precision for you and I to be here. Take, for instance, the force of gravity, the thing that keeps us, standing on the ground and in place. If that differed by its actual value in 1 part in 10 to the 60, that's a 1 with 60 zeros after it. If it differed by 1 part in 10 to the 60, life wouldn't exist. If it were just ever so slightly weaker, then all of matter would simply evaporate, just be a wide void of meaningless matter in the universe. If it was ever so slightly stronger, all of matter would coalesce and clump together in a way that wouldn't allow life to exist. And yet, we happen to have hit the razor-sharp point where gravity takes just the value it needs to be in order for you and I to exist, for chemistry, for planets, for the cosmos to be able to produce life. That's just one of an extraordinary number of finely precision-dialed attributes of the universe. And Paul Davies is one among a number of interesting thinkers pointing out the way in which the universe seems to be set up for us. Not just that, the fact there is a universe, that it came from somewhere, this thing called the Big Bang some 14 billion years ago that actually produced space, time, and matter. He talks about the origins of life and just the extraordinary complexity involved in the DNA molecule. And finally, he talks about the fact we can reflect on this, that we've got the consciousness and the ability to think about it. And this is the way he put it to me in a conversation on these issues. He said, Justin, the directionality in the universe, going from matter to life to consciousness, I would add comprehension to that. There's an arrow of time in the direction of comprehension. And if that is the case, if this is not just an enormous fluke, a happy series of accidents, then that comes to me very close to something like a meaning or a purpose in nature. I think that's a sort of religious feeling, he said, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. And I'd be tempted to reach for a Greek word to describe what Paul Davies is describing here. It's the word logos. And it's a word that's used at the beginning of John's gospel to describe the word of God, Jesus. And the logos is this idea of speaking order into chaos, life into non-life. It's the reason we're here. And I believe these scientists like Paul Davies are discovering the logos behind life. And there's this extraordinary overlap between what we find in Scripture and what our best science is telling us. So I think the energy, if you like, has moved away from that very atheistic, there is no purpose or meaning behind the cosmos view of life, to actually something very different, that there is a purpose, that human existence itself is one of the keys for why we believe there's more to life than just matter and energy. The second reason why I think there's a change in the conversation on God is not just human existence, but human value. How do we explain human value? The fact that we believe in human rights, in human equality, in human dignity, in human purpose. Again, there's a big difference between the way my atheist friends tend to look at this and the way I see it as a Christian. And it came out quite clearly in a conversation I had with perhaps the most famous atheist in the world, Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins took part in a debate at Oxford University with a well-known Christian thinker called John Lennox. And afterwards, I was able to have a short interview with him. And our conversation got on to the subject of human value. Why do we believe in morality? Why do we believe in right and wrong? And this is the way our conversation went. I'm going to quote it to you verbatim. I said to Richard Dawkins, Richard, if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he responded, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine, where failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favors is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad, that's a value judgment, glad that I live in such a society. And I responded, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say, the reason that this is good is that it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement? And he responded, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. And I said, so therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that. In any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. I said, okay, but ultimately your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And I think you could say that, and I think actually you should say that if you're a thoroughgoing naturalist atheist, as Richard Dawkins is. Why then do we recoil with horror at the idea that our belief that rape is wrong is just the happenstance of the hand that society and culture and evolution happens to have dealt us? Why do we believe actually, no, there's really right and wrong ways of treating each other? There's really right and wrong ways of living life. It's very hard to explain that idea that we all ultimately believe in probably in this room, that actually there are some things that are really right and wrong, that there are such a thing as human rights, value, dignity. It's very hard to explain that on a purely atheistic worldview. But there's a ready explanation on the Christian worldview. Right there on page 1 of the Bible, it says, humans are made in God's image. If that's true, if each and every one of us is made in God's image, that gives each and every one of us inestimable worth and value. It means there are really right and wrong ways of treating each other. So I think God is the best explanation of human value. But again, it's not just Christian thinkers pointing this out. There's all kinds of interesting secular figures who are starting to talk about this. Secular figures with big platforms. One of them is Tom Holland, not the Marvel superhero Spider-Man, I'm afraid, but the historian, Tom Holland. Some of you may have come across the historian, Tom Holland. And now, Tom Holland co-hosts probably the most popular history podcast in the world, The Rest is History. He's written a best-selling book called Dominion, which really charts the way in which over the last 2,000 years, the Christian revolution has shaped every aspect of Western democracy. His own journey, which he sketches out in the book, is a really interesting one because Tom Holland himself was raised in a sort of nominal Christian faith, but it had sputtered out by his teenage years. But as he began his career writing very popular books about the Greeks and the Romans and standing in their shoes, he realized how very different their culture was to his own. This was a culture in which the lives of women and children were very cheap compared to our own. This was a culture where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy. This was a culture where some people could be the sexual property of other people. This was a culture in which the ruling Caesar would see it as a great triumph to have slaughtered 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more. They didn't call that genocide, they gloried in it. And he realized the more he stood in the sandals of the Greeks and Romans, how different their values were to his own, because Tom Holland believed in dignity, equality, freedom, progress. Where had those come from? He realized they hadn't come from the Greeks and the Romans. He realized they hadn't come from science or atheism either. He realized where they had come from was a person, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, and the movement that his death and resurrection inspired. And he told me in a conversation, Justin, I find it very hard to believe in the claims of Christianity, but when it comes to the things I believe about life, about equality, dignity, meaning, purpose, I realize that in almost every way I am a Christian. Now, when you've got people like Tom Holland with enormous platforms saying things like this, I feel like the conversation on God has shifted a lot. Another person I could quickly introduce to you, Louise Perry, is saying remarkably interesting and similar things in the wake of Tom Holland. She published a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And Louise Perry's story is that she grew up in a typical kind of liberal feminist mindset, but it was when she started working after university at a rape crisis center, she began to question the sexual ethic that predominates in Western culture. She started to see that the way in which we treat sex and relationships is actually, in many cases, very bad for women and children. And she wrote this book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, purely from a socio-cultural evolutionary point of view. But she came to remarkably Christian conclusions in the process because she discovered there was one thing, one institution which historically, for all the negative sides of it, had at least done something to keep the guardrails, especially on male sexuality, had been able to allow communities and families and whole cultures to flourish. And it was this funny old institution called monogamous Christian marriage. And when she wrote her book, she started to realize that in almost every way, she was a Christian as well. And when you have secular thinkers looking at human value and asking, what's the cause of it? Why are we here? Where did this idea of dignity, value, intrinsic to every human being, where did that come from? A lot of people are realizing it comes from the Christian story. It's very hard to get away from that. The final reason why I think the God conversation is changing in our culture is because of human purpose as well. We've talked about why God is perhaps the best explanation for human existence, for human value, but I believe God also makes best sense of human purpose. It's the why question. It's the question that we all ask at some point in our life. The psychologists tell us that we are made to live in a story that makes sense of our life. If we feel like we don't have a story that makes sense of our life, if we're bouncing around chaotically, then that leads to really bad outcomes, to a mental health crisis. And funnily enough, we're living in a mental health crisis in the West, especially among young people. And I believe the reason we're living in that crisis is because we've lost sight of the story that once gave a sense of purpose and meaning and identity to people in the West. It was the Christian story. It was a story about how God had come in person. He'd put his image into every one of us, and that however difficult or bad life gets, we knew that God was with us in that journey, and that he'd gone through death and suffering himself and shown us the way through his resurrection to the hope of eternity. But as our culture has lost that Christian story, it doesn't mean that we don't believe in anything anymore. In fact, G.K. Chesterton famously said, when people stop believing in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. And what we're seeing in our culture is people reaching for all kinds of other stories to fill the void. I think the new atheists sort of very naively assumed that once we got rid of the Christian story, people would just replace it with this story of science and reason. But science and reason don't give you a reason to live for. And so what we see in our culture is people grabbing onto all kinds of other stories about sexuality and gender maybe on the left, or political mythologies on the right. Anything to make sense of life, but these stories are all bashing up against each other and giving us the culture wars. The question is there a story that we can live our lives by? And interestingly, I'm finding a lot of secular thinkers pointing people back again today to the Christian story. One of them is that controversial figure I mentioned earlier, Jordan Peterson, this sort of eccentric Canadian psychology professor. Now, he's a kind of we have a phrase in the UK, I don't know if you guys have heard of Marmite. It's a kind of, a particular kind of spread you can put on your toast in the morning, and people either love it or hate it. So if we say something is Marmite, you either love it or you hate it. And Jordan Peterson's a kind of a Marmite character because he's a bit of a culture warrior. But what is interesting about Jordan Peterson, whether you agree with his politics or not, is that he's had an outsized influence on young people. Because when he started to put on lectures about the book of Genesis for 2 or 3 hours at a time, he had thousands of young people, especially young men, turning up. Now that's really interesting because the same crowd that was turning out for the new atheist started turning up for Jordan Peterson. But when he talked about purpose and meaning in life, he didn't point them to science and reason, he pointed them to the Bible. Now, something really interesting is going on in our culture when people are starting to turn back to the Bible. And I don't know exactly where Jordan Peterson is on the faith issue. When I had him on my show, I asked him, so do you believe in God, Jordan? And he said, well, it depends what you mean by God. So he's kind of hard to pin down himself. But what I do know is he's opening the door to a lot of other people. I know people who walked through the door to Christian faith because people like Jordan Peterson made it intellectually possible for them to take it seriously. And he's not the only person. I think as we're seeing the waning of new atheism, we're seeing this meaning crisis bubbling up. People are asking these questions. Who am I? What am I here for? And atheism just ultimately doesn't have the answers. Because we need a better story than the story of, well, you're here in a meaningless universe and you're just a 1 billion chance. You know, that won't satisfy people. There's a better story to be told. And I'm seeing more and more people starting to discover this story. I think the tide of faith is just starting to turn. The sea of faith has gone out a long way in our culture, but I wonder whether we're just starting to see the turning of the tide. One of the interesting people who have seen that tide turn for themselves is a woman called Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was probably the most famous female atheist in the world. If there was going to be a fifth horsewoman of the new atheism, then it would have been Ayaan Hirsi Ali, because her story is that she grew up in Somalia under an Islamic regime in which she was sort of indoctrinated into this form of fundamentalist Islam, but ultimately fled to Europe from a forced marriage. And when she got there, she completely rejected her faith. She rejected God. She wrote a best-selling book called Infidel about the dangers of religion. And she joined the Four Horsemen of New Atheism on stages, on book tours, on their TV shows. But just last year in November, Ayaan Hirsi Ali wrote a viral article titled, "Why I Am Now a Christian." And it's the most extraordinary thing, because in it she talks about some of the reasons why she feels that, in the way that Tom Holland has spelled out, Christianity is really the foundation of Western civilization, of Western values, of Western morality, and the dangers she senses from hegemonic forces like Russia and China, fundamentalist Islam, and even what she sees as woke ideologies that are threatening our culture. And she believes only Christianity can, if you like, stand against some of those forces. But there's a really interesting personal story she's also opened up about in some of her interviews. She talks about going on a journey where she ultimately found that the atheism she'd adopted just didn't make sense of life. She didn't have a why to live for. And increasingly, she got more and more depressed, alcoholic. She went through a number of therapists and counselors. She tried all the different ways in which you can try to pull yourself out of that, but none of them seemed to be working. Finally, one of her counselors said to her, "Have you tried praying?" And Ayaan said, "Well, I can't pray. I don't believe in God. The God I was raised with was a monster." And this counselor said, "Well, what kind of God do you think you could believe in?" And as Ayaan started to describe the God she could potentially believe in, she said, "I realized I was describing Jesus Christ." And she thought, well, maybe I don't need to look for another God. Maybe I should investigate the one this person claimed to be, Jesus Christ. And as she did that, and as she started to attend church, she found her life was turning around. She found prayer was the thing she'd been looking for her whole life, that Jesus Christ was the person she'd been looking for her whole life. Now look, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I don't know exactly where she is on the faith journey, but what I do know is that her story is emblematic of what I've been seeing happen in our culture recently. The new atheism has failed people. It held out all these promises, but it's failed to deliver on them. And now we're living in this meaning crisis where people are desperate for a story to make sense of their life. And they're reaching in all kinds of directions, but it's failing them. Guess what? We have the greatest story ever told. And I think people are ready to hear it again in our culture. I don't know about you, but I sense that something's changing. There's a wind of change happening. I see it in little pockets of places, things like the Asbury Awakening a year and a half ago. Gen Z are desperate. There's a spiritual thirst and hunger, and I've met some of them, and I've seen that there's a new openness that I've never seen before in any other generation to something. They don't always call it God, but if we can tell them the better story, the true and beautiful story, I think there's a potential for a real tide coming back. People who have been, people who are desperate for a better story. So I just want to encourage you, because very often it can feel like in a post-Christian West, all the news stories are negative, especially about the church. And don't get me wrong, there are some things the church needs to face up to in terms of its scandals, its politicization. There's a lot of stuff we need to put in order in our own house. But there's good news. God is not finished with the church. And I believe that we could be standing on the shore of that incoming tide. Let's meet those people, those meaning seekers who are looking for a better story. Let's tell them why they can believe in a God who makes sense of their existence, who makes sense of their value, and ultimately who makes sense of their purpose, because he came in person to show them what life is about in the person of Jesus Christ. I hope this has been an encouragement, and let's just pray that our story can join with God's big story and that we will see many people come to know him in our generation. God bless you guys.